He conquered 5 kingdoms, broke every bloodline that stood against him. They called him the Alpha King, the wolf who devoured empires whole. But on the night his own daughter lay dying from poison in her veins, Kyle Draven sat watching fireworks with another woman. And when his queen crawled across that throne room floor begging him to save their child, he looked down at her like she was dirt beneath his claws and said the one thing no father should ever speak out loud. This is not a love story. This is a reckoning. Stay with me until the very end, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city you are watching from tonight, because this tale is about to get brutal. The blood moon hung low and swollen over the capital like a wound that refused to close. It stained the marble towers of Dravenmoor a deep arterial red, turning every window into a bleeding eye staring down at the streets below. The air smelled of roasting elk and sweet wine and the oiled leather of 10,000 soldiers standing at attention along the royal processional, their spears catching that sick crimson light until the whole avenue looked like a forest of burning teeth. Celine Vale stood at the top of the grand staircase with her hands clasped in front of her, perfectly still, perfectly composed, and perfectly aware that every single noble in the courtyard below was watching to see if she would crack. She would not crack. She had spent 14 hours preparing this night. The banquet tables alone had taken her 6 days to arrange, each seat assigned according to bloodline rank, each plate bearing the Draven crest in hand-pressed silver leaf. She had personally tasted every dish in the kitchen that morning, standing over the cooks with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her hair tied back like a common serving woman. She had selected the musicians, approved the wine, chosen the flowers for Lyra's ceremonial crown. White winter roses, because they were the only bloom that could survive a blood moon's heat without wilting. She had done all of this because tonight was the most important night of her daughter's life, and because she knew, with the grim certainty of a woman who had stopped believing in miracles a long time ago, that her husband would find some way to ruin it. She just did not expect him to ruin it like this. The royal carriage appeared at the far end of the avenue, drawn by 4 black warhorses with braided manes and iron shoes that struck sparks off the cobblestones. The crowd roared. Soldiers slammed their spear butts against the ground in the traditional greeting. Celine felt the vibration travel up through the marble steps and into her bones. She lifted her chin. She arranged her face into the expression she had perfected over 15 years of marriage, the one that said nothing and revealed nothing and cost her everything. The carriage door opened. Kyle stepped out first. He was tall. He had always been tall. Broad through the shoulders, narrow at the hip, with the kind of hard predatory grace that made lesser men instinctively step backward. His black hair was longer than when he had left 3 months ago, tied at the nape with a leather cord, and there was a new scar running along the edge of his jaw that he had not bothered to have healed. He wore his campaign armor, still dusty from the road, because Kyle Draven had never once in his life cared about looking presentable when he could look dangerous instead. He turned back to the carriage and extended his hand. A woman's fingers appeared in the doorway. Slender, pale, adorned with 3 rings that caught the blood moon's light and threw it back in fractured scarlet. Then the rest of her followed. Auburn hair falling in loose waves past her shoulders, a traveling cloak of deep green velvet trimmed with silver fox fur, a face that Celine had not seen in 16 years but had never once forgotten. Seraphine Ashmore. The courtyard went silent, not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence that happens when 1,000 people simultaneously realize they are witnessing something terrible and none of them know where to look. Celine did not move. She did not blink. She watched Seraphine take Kyle's arm and step down onto the cobblestones as though she belonged there, as though this was her homecoming, as though the woman standing at the top of the stairs with a crown on her head and 15 years of sacrifice carved into every line of her face was simply part of the decoration. General Aldrich Voss materialized at Celine's elbow. He was the only man in the kingdom who could approach her without being announced, partly because he commanded the royal guard and partly because he had been her dead brother's closest friend, and there were some bonds that even thrones could not sever. "My queen." His voice was barely a breath. "Say the word, and I will have the gates closed." "You will do no such thing." "Celine, you will stand at your post, General. You will smile. You will welcome whoever the king brings through those gates, and you will not use my name again tonight." Voss stared at her. She could feel the heat of his fury radiating off him like a forge. He was a big man, scarred and weathered, with hands that had broken more necks than he could probably count, and in that moment he looked like he wanted to break one more. "This is a humiliation," he said. "Yes." "A deliberate one?" "Yes. And you will simply stand here and accept it." Celine finally turned to look at him. Her eyes were dry. Her voice was steady, and something in her expression made Voss, a man who had charged headlong into cavalry formations without flinching, take half a step back. "I will stand here," she said, "because my daughter is watching me from the eastern balcony right now, and if I fall apart, she will learn that a woman's only option in the face of betrayal is to crumble. So I will not crumble, Aldrich. Not tonight. Not ever. Now get back in line before someone notices you care." Voss clenched his jaw hard enough that Celine heard his teeth grind. He gave a stiff nod and retreated to his position among the guard. Celine returned her gaze to the approaching figures. Kael climbed the stairs without hurrying. He never hurried. He reached the top and stopped in front of Celine with Seraphine still on his arm, and for a long, terrible moment, nobody spoke. Up close, she could see it all. The road dust in the creases of his armor. The faint smell of horse sweat and pine smoke clinging to his cloak. The way his golden eyes, those predator's eyes that had once looked at her like she was the only solid thing in a collapsing world, now passed over her with the mild disinterest of a man glancing at a piece of furniture he had long ago stopped noticing. "Queen Celine." He said it the way you would greet a servant whose name you only half remembered. "The banquet looks adequate. This is Lady Seraphine Ashmore. She will be staying as a guest of the crown. See that suitable chambers are prepared." Celine looked at Seraphine. Seraphine looked back. There was no malice in her expression. That was the worst part. It would have been easier if there had been triumph or cruelty or even the faintest flicker of guilt. Instead, there was only the calm, settled confidence of a woman who knew exactly where she stood and was not even slightly threatened by the woman whose place she was taking. "Welcome to Dravenmoor, Lady Ashmore." Celine's voice did not waver. "I hope your journey was comfortable." "It was," Seraphine said. Her voice was low, musical, with the faint rounded vowels of the southern highlands. "King Kael was kind enough to ensure every detail of my comfort. He is remarkably attentive when he chooses to be." The silence in the courtyard somehow deepened. Somewhere behind her, Celine heard a noblewoman inhale sharply. She felt the eyes of 500 aristocrats boring into her spine. She felt the blood moon pressing down on her skull like a hot red hand. "Yes," Celine said. "He can be." She turned and walked into the palace without waiting for either of them to follow. Her spine was straight. Her steps were even. She made it all the way through the entrance hall, past the twin columns of obsidian, past the portraits of the Draven ancestors she had helped put on those walls, past the honor guard who stared straight ahead and pretended they had not seen a thing, and into the narrow service corridor behind the kitchens before she pressed her back against the stone wall and let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 16 years. Her hands were shaking. She clamped them against her thighs and squeezed until the trembling stopped. Then she pressed her palms flat against the cool stone and focused on the sensation, the rough grain, the faint dampness, the realness of something solid beneath her fingers. "Not tonight," she whispered to no one. "You can break tomorrow. Not tonight." She straightened. She smoothed her gown. She walked back out into the light and became the queen again. The banquet hall was the largest enclosed space in Dravenmoor, a vaulted cathedral of black stone and iron chandeliers that could seat 1,000 guests and still have room for the servants to move freely between tables. Tonight it held every major noble house in the Wolf Kingdom, their heirs, their retainers, and their appetites for drama. The air was thick with the smell of roasted game and spiced cider and the subtle electric crackle of social warfare. Celine sat at the head table in the queen's chair, which was 3 inches shorter than the king's chair because Kael had commissioned it that way 6 years ago, and she had never asked why because she already knew. To her left sat the empty seat reserved for Lyra, who had not yet made her entrance. To her right sat Duchess Mora Blackthorn, a hawkish woman of 60 with iron-gray hair and the kind of expression that suggested she had been disappointed by the world since birth and had never quite gotten over it. "He brought her in through the front gate," Mora said without preamble, spearing a piece of elk with her fork. "Not the side entrance, not the servants' passage. The front gate, in full view of the processional. That was not carelessness, Your Majesty. That was a message." I am aware, Duchess. The message being that your position in this court is no longer secure. I said I am aware. What do you intend to do about it? Celine picked up her wine goblet, found it empty, and set it back down. I intend to watch my daughter complete her ceremony. I intend to smile at every noble who speaks to me, and I intend to get through this night without giving a single person in this room a reason to pity me more than they already do. Mora studied her for a long moment. You are too proud for pity, child. That has always been your problem. Pride is a luxury only the powerful can afford, and you have been spending it like a woman who does not realize her accounts are empty. My accounts are not empty. Your husband brought his former lover to your daughter's ceremony and seated her in a carriage meant only for royalty. Your accounts, my queen, are dust. Celine said nothing. Mora leaned closer. I knew your mother, the old duchess said. Alindra of the Moonfang. She was twice the wolf Kale-Draven will ever be, and she would not have sat here swallowing her own blood while a man made a fool of her in her own hall. She would have torn his throat out and dealt with the consequences in the morning. My mother is dead. Her clan is scattered, and the world she lived in no longer exists. Does it not? Mora's eyes were sharp. The Moonfang were the oldest bloodline in the north. Their magic held the frozen wastes together for 1,000 years. That blood runs in your veins, Celine, and in your daughters. Do not tell me that world no longer exists when I can see it looking out at me through your eyes every time you think no one is watching. A trumpet sounded. Both women turned toward the far end of the hall where the ceremonial doors were opening. Princess Lyra Draven entered the banquet for the first time as a woman grown. She was 14, small for her age, with her mother's sharp cheekbones and her father's golden eyes, and a mane of dark silver hair that fell past her shoulders like poured moonlight. She wore the traditional white ceremonial gown, unadorned, because the coming-of-age ritual required the princess to present herself as she was before the kingdom decided what she would become. She walked with her hands at her sides and her chin lifted, and a look on her face that was trying very hard to be brave and almost succeeding. Celine's chest ached. She pressed her palm flat against the table and breathed through it. Lyra reached the head table and stopped before her mother. The hall waited. Mother? Lyra's voice was thin but clear. I present myself before the blood moon and ask for your blessing to take my place among the wolves. Kneel, Celine said. Lyra knelt. Celine stood and placed both hands on her daughter's head. The girl's hair was soft and slightly damp with nervous sweat. Celine could feel the faint tremor running through Lyra's body, the rapid flutter of her pulse, the barely contained terror of a child who knew that every eye in the kingdom was fixed on her, and that her father had not even bothered to watch. I give you my blessing, Celine said, not as a queen, as your mother. Whatever the world asks of you after tonight, remember that you were loved before you were useful. Rise. Lyra stood. Her eyes were bright with tears she was too disciplined to shed. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead briefly against her mother's shoulder in the old Moonfang gesture of gratitude, and Celine held her there for one heartbeat longer than protocol allowed, because she had a feeling in her gut that she could not name but could not ignore. The kind of feeling that animals get before an earthquake, when the ground has not yet moved, but something deep down has already shifted. Go to your seat, Celine said quietly, and eat slowly. The wine tonight is stronger than you are used to. Lyra nodded and took her place. The banquet unfolded the way these things always did, course after course of rich food and richer gossip, the nobility performing their eternal theater of alliances and insults disguised as compliments. Celine watched from her shortened chair and said the things that were expected of her, and noticed that Kael had placed Seraphine at the far end of the high table in the seat traditionally reserved for visiting royalty, which meant he was either making a political statement or he simply did not care about the difference, and she honestly did not know which possibility was worse. Lord Harlan Trevane, master of coin, and the most ambitious man in a room full of ambitious men, made his way to the head table between courses. He was thin, quick-eyed, with the permanent half-smile of someone who calculated profit margins during funerals. A magnificent evening, Your Majesty. The princess looks radiant. Thank you, Lord Trevane. I could not help but notice the king's guest. Lady Ashmore, is it not? I seem to recall she was quite prominent in court before your time. Celine met his eyes. Before my time, Lord Trevane, The Wolf Kingdom was a collection of feuding clans without a unified army, a functioning treasury, or a wall strong enough to stop a determined goat. I built your time. Remember that. Trevaine's smile flickered. He bowed and retreated. Mora, who had been listening, made a small sound of approval. Good. Bleed them when they come sniffing. It is the only language they understand. The ceremonial wine arrived at midnight, carried by 4 attendants in procession. It was the centerpiece of the coming-of-age ritual, a goblet of moonblood wine brewed specifically for the occasion from rare berries that grew only during a blood moon cycle, mixed with the ceremonial herbs that would symbolically awaken the wolf spirit within the young princess. Celine had overseen the brewing herself. She had tested the seals. She had approved every ingredient. She had not, however, been present when the goblet was transferred from the cellar to the banquet hall, because during that exact window of time, a servant had come to tell her that King Kyle wished to speak with her privately, and she had gone to the antechamber like a fool, only to find it empty. And by the time she returned, the goblet was already on the table and the ceremony was already underway. She would not realize the significance of this for several more hours. By then, it would be far too late. Lyra stood before the assembled court with the goblet in both hands. The hall fell silent again, this time with genuine reverence, because whatever games the adults played, the coming of age was sacred to the wolf clans, and even the most cynical noble knew better than to disrespect it openly. Drink, the ceremonial elder intoned, and may the blood moon reveal what lives within you. Lyra raised the goblet. She drank. The first sign was subtle, a faint tremor in her hands as she lowered the cup, then a blink that lasted too long, then a visible tightening around her mouth as though she had bitten into something bitter. Celine was on her feet before anyone else moved. Lyra. The girl looked at her mother. Her golden eyes were dilating unevenly, the left pupil ballooning while the right contracted to a pinpoint, and in that asymmetry, Celine saw something she recognized from her Moonfang training, from the hours spent memorizing the symptoms of every toxin known to the northern clans, because her mother had once told her that a queen who cannot identify poison is already dead. Lyra, put the cup down. Put it down now. Lyra opened her mouth to speak. No words came out. Instead, a thin line of dark blood trickled from her left nostril, tracing a slow path down her upper lip. And then her knees gave out and she collapsed forward onto the stone floor with a sound that Celine would hear in her nightmares for the rest of her life. A sound like something precious hitting something hard. The hall erupted. Celine was already moving. She shoved past the ceremonial elder, dropped to her knees beside Lyra, and pulled the girl's head into her lap. Lyra's skin was burning. Her pupils were fully dilated now, both of them, black swallowing gold, and her breathing was rapid and shallow and wrong. Healer, Celine's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Get me a healer now, and seal this room. Nobody leaves until I say so. General Voss appeared at her side. His face was ashen. My queen, what happened? What is wrong with her? She has been poisoned. Night bloom extract mixed with something else, something I do not recognize. Find me whoever handled the ceremonial wine after it left the cellar. Find them now, Aldrich. Alive. Voss disappeared into the crowd. Celine held Lyra's shaking body against her chest and began whispering the old Moonfang words, the healing invocations her mother had taught her as a child, the ones she had not spoken aloud in 15 years because using Moonfang magic in Kael's court was an unspoken transgression, a reminder that she came from a power older and deeper than his, and she had learned early in her marriage that reminding Kael of that was a mistake she would always pay for. She did not care anymore. The words rose from somewhere beneath her ribs, ancient and resonant, tasting of cold mountain air and pine resin and the silver light of moons that had set 1,000 years ago. She pressed her palm against Lyra's forehead and pushed everything she had into the girl, not healing exactly, because Moonfang magic did not heal so much as it held. It gripped the thread of a life and refused to let go. It dug its claws into the space between heartbeats and fought for every single one. Lyra convulsed, her back arched, her mouth opened in a silent scream. Stay with me. Celine's hands were steady even as her voice cracked. Stay with me, little wolf. I did not carry you for 9 months and bleed for 16 hours and fight off a lung fever in your first winter just to lose you to a coward with a poison bottle. You stay with me. The court healers arrived, 3 of them, pale and flustered and clearly out of their depth. Celine told them what she suspected, gave them precise instructions on which counteragents to prepare, and watched their faces as they realized that the Queen knew more about toxicology than all three of them combined. "How do you know this?" the chief healer stammered. "Because where I come from," Celine said, "women learn to identify every poison before they learn to walk. Now do what I told you or get out of my way, and I will do it myself." They did what she told them. An hour passed, then 2. Lyra stabilized barely, her breathing evening out into something that was still too fast, but no longer the desperate, irregular gasping that had been slowly peeling Celine's sanity away, one breath at a time. The girl was moved to the royal healing chambers. Celine went with her, holding her hand, refusing to let go even when the healers needed to work. At some point she became aware that Kael was not there. Had not been there. Had not appeared at any point during the 2 hours his daughter spent fighting for her life on a banquet hall floor. She called for Voss. "Where is the king?" Voss hesitated. That hesitation told Celine everything she needed to know, but she asked again anyway because she needed to hear it spoken aloud, needed the words to exist in the air between them so that she could hold them and weigh them and decide exactly what they meant. "Where is the king, General?" "He is in the Eastern Tower, Lady Ashmore's chambers. He knows what happened to Lyra. He was informed immediately, my queen. I delivered the message personally." And his response? Another hesitation, this one longer. Voss looked like a man being asked to swallow broken glass. "He said the healers would handle it. He said he had full confidence in the court physicians. And then he asked me to close the door because the fireworks were about to begin, and Lady Ashmore had expressed a desire to watch them." Celine stared at him. The silence between them was absolute. She could hear Lyra's breathing in the next room, thin and labored. She could hear the distant pop and crackle of blood moon fireworks exploding over the city, red and gold against the crimson sky. Celebration colors for a celebration that had ended 2 hours ago in blood and poison and her daughter's body hitting stone. "Leave me," she said. "My queen, Leave me, Aldrich, please." He left. Celine stood alone in the corridor outside her daughter's room and listened to the fireworks and the breathing and the terrible vast silence where her marriage used to be. She stood there for a long time. The fireworks ended. The breathing continued. She counted each one. When she had counted enough to be certain that Lyra would survive the night, she walked to the throne hall. The great hall was empty now, cleared of revelers. The tables still littered with the remains of the banquet. Plates of half-eaten food, overturned goblets, napkins stained with wine. The blood moon poured through the high windows and painted everything the color of old wounds. Celine walked the length of the hall alone, her footsteps echoing in the silence, and stopped before the twin thrones on the raised dais. Kael's throne was massive, carved from a single piece of black iron ore, bristling with wolf motifs and claw marks. Hers was smaller, softer, positioned slightly behind and to the left, the traditional placement for a consort, a decoration, an afterthought. She sank to her knees on the cold stone floor. She did not know how long she stayed there before she heard the footsteps. Heavy, unhurried, the confident stride of a man who owned the ground beneath him and never let you forget it. Kael entered the throne hall still wearing the clothes he had worn to Seraphine's chambers. There was wine on his collar. His eyes were bright with drink and something else, something languid and satisfied that Celine recognized and refused to name. "Celine," he sounded mildly annoyed, like a man who had been interrupted during something more pleasant. "It is late. Why are you on the floor?" "Our daughter was poisoned tonight." "Yes, I was told. The healers have it under control." "She nearly died, Kael." "But she did not. Children are resilient." Celine looked up at him from her knees. The blood moonlight fell across his face, and for the first time in years she truly saw him. Not the king, not the legend, not the golden-eyed conqueror she had sacrificed her entire world for, but the man underneath. And the man underneath was hollow, had maybe always been hollow, had maybe only ever been a hunger wearing a crown. "Come to the healing chambers," she said. "Hold her hand. Let her know her father was there when she wakes." "She is unconscious. She will not know whether I was there or not." "She will ask. When she opens her eyes, the first thing she will ask is where her father was." Kael shrugged. The gesture was so casual, so devoid of weight, that it hit Celine harder than a fist. Tell her I was attending to matters of state. She is old enough to understand that a king's duties do not pause for minor incidents. Minor incidents. Celine's voice was very quiet. Your daughter's blood was on the floor of your banquet hall. Your child was seizing in my arms while you watched fireworks with your whore, and you call it a minor incident. Kael's expression changed. The languid warmth vanished, replaced by something cold and flat and utterly still. He took one step toward her, and even after 15 years, even after everything, some animal part of Celine's brain screamed at her to lower her eyes and make herself small. She did not. Choose your next words very carefully, Kael said. Or what? What will you do to me that you have not already done? Strip me of my title? Give my chambers to Seraphine? Seat me at the children's table at my own daughter's ceremony? You have already taken everything, Kael. There is nothing left to threaten me with. There is always something left. No, there is not. Because the only thing I had left was the belief that underneath everything, underneath the coldness and the cruelty and the years of making me smaller, you still loved our daughter, and tonight you proved that was a lie too. Kael stared down at her. His golden eyes caught the blood moon's light and held it. When he spoke, his voice was flat, final, empty of everything except the truth he had been carrying for years and had simply never bothered to say out loud until now. A child carrying half your blood is hardly worth mourning. The words landed in the silence between them and detonated. Celine did not scream. She did not weep. She did not launch herself at him with claws and teeth the way every fiber of her body demanded. Instead, something inside her completed a process that had been underway for years. A slow structural failure, a crack propagating through stone, and in the silence after his words, the last load-bearing wall in the architecture of her devotion collapsed without a sound. She looked at him, and she did not see her husband anymore. She did not see the man she loved. She saw the ruins of something she had built with her own hands and filled with her own blood, and he had never even noticed was there. "Thank you," she said. Kael frowned. "For what?" "For saying it out loud. I have been waiting 15 years for you to be honest with me. I did not expect it to feel like this, but I suppose honesty was never supposed to be comfortable." She rose from her knees. "Good night, my king." She turned and walked away. Kael watched her go with the expression of a man who had won an argument so completely that it had not occurred to him to wonder what he had lost. He would wonder later. Celine returned to the healing chambers. Lyra was sleeping, her breathing steadier now, color slowly returning to her cheeks. The chief healer reported that the worst had passed, but the princess would need weeks of recovery and that traces of the toxin would remain in her bloodline for months. "Will there be lasting damage?" Celine asked. "We cannot say yet. The poison was sophisticated. Whoever crafted it knew exactly what they were doing." Celine sat beside her daughter's bed and held her hand and watched the blood moon slowly descend toward the horizon. The red light faded by degrees, replaced by the cold blue-gray of approaching dawn. She sat in that changing light and thought about everything she had given and everything that had been taken and the immense, unbridgeable distance between the two. She thought about her mother, Alindra, standing at the gates of the Moonfang stronghold on the night Celine left. The old woman had not wept, had not begged, had simply looked at her daughter with eyes that held 1,000 years of accumulated sorrow and said, "You will come back. They always come back. The mountain does not chase the river, child. It simply waits." Celine had not understood then. She had been young, drunk on Kael's promises, burning with the certainty that she was choosing love over legacy, passion over duty. She had handed over her clan's crystal reserves, their sacred weapons, the warrior oaths that had protected the Moonfang for generations, all of it poured into Kael's war chest to fuel his conquest of the 5 kingdoms. She had betrayed her own blood for a man who now could not be bothered to walk down a hallway when that blood was dying. Dawn broke over Dravenmore. The blood moon set. Lyra stirred. "Mama?" Celine leaned forward. "I am here." "What happened?" "I remember the wine, and then everything went dark and hot." "You were sick. You were going to be all right." "Where's father?" There it was. The question Celine had known was coming. She looked at her daughter's face, still drawn and pale. Those golden eyes so much like Kael's, and yet so utterly different, because they still held something his had lost a long time ago. "Your father is attending to the kingdom," Celine said. "He asked me to watch over you." The lie tasted like ashes. But Lyra smiled, a small, tired, trusting smile, and Celine decided that some lies were worth the cost of your own integrity if they kept one more piece of a child's heart intact for a little while longer. Voss came to see her that afternoon. He stood in the doorway of the healing chamber with his hands behind his back and his face set in the careful blankness that military men adopt when they are about to deliver very bad news. "We found the servant who carried the ceremonial wine from the cellar," he said. "And?" "Dead, hung from a beam in the lower storerooms. The guards are calling it a suicide." "Do you believe that?" "I believe someone wanted us to stop asking questions." Celine nodded slowly. "What else?" Voss looked at Lyra's sleeping form, then back at Celine. He lowered his voice. "I have been asking questions anyway." Quietly. "The diversion that pulled you away from the wine preparation, the message that Kael wanted to speak with you privately. I checked with every member of the king's retinue. He never sent that message. Someone used his name to get me out of the room. Yes. So they could access the wine. Yes. Who had access to the cellar during the window I was gone?" Voss was quiet for a long time. Too long. "Aldrich, who had access?" "3 people. The cellar master, who is now dead, a kitchen attendant named Roz, who I have placed under discreet surveillance, and Lady Ashmore's personal maid, who was seen entering the service corridors at the exact time the wine was being transported." Celine closed her eyes. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth and counted to 5, and did not allow herself to feel anything at all because if she started feeling now, she would not be able to stop. And there were things that needed to be done, and they needed to be done by someone who was thinking clearly. "Does Kael know any of this?" "I reported my findings this morning, all of them." "His response?" "He said that Lady Ashmore's staff are above suspicion and that I should redirect my investigation toward the rebel factions in the Eastern Territories." "He is protecting her." "Yes, my queen. He is protecting her." Celine opened her eyes. She looked at the general standing in the doorway, this man who had been her brother's friend and her daughter's guardian, and the only person in this entire wretched court who had never once asked her for anything except the chance to serve. "Aldrich, my queen, if I asked you to do something terrible, would you do it?" "I would burn this palace to the ground and salt the earth beneath it. You know this." "That is not what I'm going to ask." She stood. She crossed the room and stopped in front of him and spoke in a voice so low that even the sleeping girl could not have heard it. "I need 3 horses, provisions for 2 weeks, a healing kit with moonroot concentrate and blood stabilizer. I need the northern gate left unguarded between the 3rd and 4th bell tonight, and I need you to forget this conversation ever happened." Voss stared at her. She watched the understanding arrive in his eyes, watched it crash through him like a wave. "You're leaving." "I'm taking my daughter somewhere safe." "Celine, if you cross the border without the king's permission, it is treason. He will send riders after you. He will do nothing, because by the time he notices we are gone, he will have much bigger problems than a missing wife." "What do you mean?" Celine looked past him, through the window, to the city beyond. Dravenmore gleamed in the afternoon sun, all those marble towers and iron walls, and the great shimmering dome of the protective barrier that arced over the capital like a cupped hand holding back the darkness. The barrier that everyone believed was sustained by the Draven bloodline. The barrier that the court wizards maintained was powered by the crystal reserves embedded in the castle foundations. They were half right. The crystals provided the fuel, but the engine, the living heart that channeled that power into a coherent shield, the ancient binding that turned raw crystal energy into an impenetrable wall of force that had always been something else entirely. Moonfang blood. Her blood. Every night for 15 years, while the palace slept, Celine had descended alone to the crystal chamber beneath the castle and pressed her palms against the anchor stones and poured her life force into the barrier that protected a kingdom that did not know it depended on her. She had done it without recognition, without gratitude, without anyone ever knowing, because that was what Moonfang women did. They protected, even the things that hurt them, even the people who did not deserve it. But she was done protecting things that hurt her. "The northern gate," she said. "3rd bell. Can you do it?" Voss held her gaze for a long time. Something passed between them that neither of them spoke aloud. A grief shared, a future foreclosed, the quiet mutual understanding of two people who knew that the right choice and the easy choice had never once in the history of the world been the same thing. "It will be done," he said. He turned to leave. At the doorway he stopped. "The barrier," he said without turning around. "How long after you leave?" "Days. Maybe a week. The crystals will hold residual charge for a while, but without a living anchor, the degradation will accelerate exponentially. Within a month, there will be gaps large enough for a beast horde to walk through. And you are willing to let that happen, to this city, to these people." Celine looked at her daughter's sleeping face, at the dark circles under her eyes, at the faint traces of blood still crusted at the edge of her nostril. "These people watched a woman pour poison into my daughter's cup, and none of them said a word. These people laughed behind their hands when my husband paraded his lover through my home. These people took everything I built and everything I bled for and told themselves they owed me nothing." She met Voss's eyes. "I am not burning this kingdom down, Aldrich. I am simply stopping the thing that kept it standing. What happens after that is not my burden to carry anymore." Voss left without another word. Night fell over Dravenmoor. The palace grew quiet. Celine sat beside Lyra's bed and waited and watched the moon rise, a white moon this time, clean and cold and nothing like the swollen red eye that had presided over the worst night of her life. At the second bell, she woke her daughter. "Mama, what time is it?" "Late, we need to go." "Go where?" Celine knelt beside the bed and took Lyra's face in her hands. The girl was still weak, still pale, still carrying poison in her blood, but her eyes were clear and her pulse was steady, and sometimes that was enough. Sometimes that had to be enough. "Home," Celine said. "I am taking you home." "This is home." "No, little wolf. This was never home. Home is a place where the people who love you would die before they let you bleed, and we have never had that here. But we are going to find it." Lyra looked at her mother in the moonlight. She was 14 years old, and she had been poisoned at her own ceremony. And her father had not come. And she understood, in the way that children understand things they cannot yet articulate, that something fundamental had broken and was never going to be repaired. "Will father come looking for us?" "Eventually." "Will he find us?" Celine smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a woman who had spent 15 years learning exactly how little she was valued and had finally decided to teach the lesson back. "He will try," she said. They moved through the palace like ghosts. Celine knew every corridor, every service passage, every forgotten stairwell, because she had spent 15 years mapping this castle the way a prisoner maps their cage, not out of curiosity, but out of the bone-deep understanding that one day she would need to escape it. She carried Lyra when the girl's legs gave out and set her down when she found her strength again, and did not rush because rushing made noise, and noise made witnesses, and witnesses made chains. The northern gate was unmanned. 3 horses waited in the shadow of the outer wall, saddled and provisioned, with Voss's personal seal on the saddlebags. There was a note tucked into the bridle of the lead horse. Celine did not read it. She already knew what it said. She lifted Lyra onto the middle horse, mounted the lead, and tied the third to a trailing rope. They rode through the gate and into the darkness beyond the walls of Dravenmoor without looking back. Behind them, deep beneath the palace, in the crystal chamber that no one visited except a queen who was no longer there, the anchor stones pulsed once, twice, and then began, so slowly that it was almost imperceptible, to dim. The first crack appeared in the barrier at dawn. Nobody noticed. They rode north for 3 days without stopping longer than it took to water the horses and force dried meat between Lyra's clenched teeth. The girl ate because her mother told her to eat, slept in the saddle because her mother tied her to it, and kept breathing because her mother's hand pressed flat against her back every few hours to check the rhythm of her lungs. The poison was still in her. Celine could feel it, a dull wrongness pulsing through the girl's bloodstream like a second heartbeat running slightly out of time with the first. The northern road was not really a road. It was a scar cut through old-growth forest by traders who had stopped using it decades ago when the beast hordes made the route too dangerous for anything short of a full military column. The trees closed overhead like a fist, blocking the sky, turning daylight into a green-gray murk that smelled of rotting bark and standing water. Every few miles, the horses would stop and refuse to move, ears flat, nostrils flaring, sensing something in the undergrowth that Celine could not see, but had no intention of waiting around to meet. On the second night, Lyra woke screaming. Celine was beside her before the echo died. The girl was upright, drenched in sweat, clawing at her own arms with nails that had drawn blood in 3 places. "It burns! Mama, it burns! I can feel it moving under my skin. I can feel it." "Look at me." Celine grabbed her wrists. "Look at me, Lyra. Breathe." I cannot breathe. It is in my chest. It is." "You are breathing right now. You are speaking words to me right now, which means air is moving through your body. The poison is fighting you because you are fighting it. Stop fighting." "How? How do I stop?" "You let it hurt. You let it burn, and you keep breathing through it because your body is stronger than whatever they put inside you, and your body knows how to win this fight, even if your mind does not. Trust the blood, Lyra. Trust what I gave you." Lyra's fingers dug into Celine's arms hard enough to bruise. Her breathing was ragged, torn, the desperate rhythm of a body at war with itself. But she held her mother's gaze and she did not look away, and after a long, terrible minute, the screaming tension in her muscles began to ease, degree by degree, like a wire being slowly unwound from a spool. "That is my girl." Celine's voice was rough. "That is my wolf." Lyra collapsed against her. Celine held her and rocked her, and did not make a single sound because the sounds building in her chest were the kind that would frighten a child, and Lyra had been frightened enough. By the 3rd day, the forest began to change. The trees grew taller, older, their trunks wide enough that 3 men linking arms could not have circled them. The air turned cold. Not the pleasant chill of autumn, but a deep structural cold that lived in the ground and the stone and the marrow of everything, the kind of cold that does not pass because it is not weather. It is geography. It is the land itself telling you that you have crossed a line and the rules are different here. Lyra pulled her cloak tighter. "Where are we?" "The Grey March, the border between the Wolf Kingdom and the Frozen Reach." "Nobody lives in the Frozen Reach." "That is what the Wolf Kingdom wants people to believe." "Is it true?" Celine did not answer immediately. She was watching the tree line ahead, where the forest thinned and the ground rose sharply into a ridge of dark stone crowned with ice. Beyond that ridge lay the territory she had not seen since she was 19 years old. The place she had abandoned for a man who could not be bothered to hold his daughter's hand while she died. "The Moonfang live there," she said, "or what is left of them." "Your clan, my mother's clan, my grandmother's clan. 1,000 years of women who built something in the most inhospitable land on this continent and held it against everything the world threw at them. I walked away from that. I gave it up. And I have spent every single day since then pretending that what I got in return was worth the price." Lyra was quiet for a while. The horses picked their way up the rocky slope, hooves clattering on loose shale. "Was it?" Lyra asked. "Worth it?" Celine looked at her daughter, thin, pale, still carrying poison in her blood, still wearing the remnants of a ceremonial gown that was now torn and stained and utterly ruined. 14 years old and already learning the lesson that most women spent their whole lives trying to avoid, that the people who are supposed to protect you are sometimes the ones you need protection from. "You were worth it," Celine said. "Nothing else. Just you." They crested the ridge at dusk. Below them, the frozen reach spread out like a vast white wound, mile after mile of snow and ice and the dark, jagged teeth of mountains rising along the far horizon. The wind hit them immediately, a wall of cold that stripped the breath from Celine's lungs and made Lyra gasp and hunch forward in her saddle. And there, cut into the face of the nearest mountain, barely visible beneath centuries of ice and neglect, was a gate. Celine stopped her horse. She stared at it. The last time she had passed through that gate, her mother had been standing on the other side watching her leave with an expression that Celine had spent 15 years calling disappointment and was only now recognizing as grief. "Stay behind me," she told Lyra. "Do not speak unless spoken to, and do not under any circumstances show fear." "Who lives behind that gate?" "People I betrayed. People who have every reason to kill us both on sight. And we are riding toward them." "Yes." "Do you have a plan?" "I have my blood. In the Moonfang, that used to be enough." They rode down the slope and across the frozen plain toward the gate. Before they had covered half the distance, figures appeared on the walls above, dark shapes against the gray sky, and Celine heard the unmistakable sound of bows being drawn and held. A voice rang out from the top of the wall, female, sharp, carrying the clipped accent of the northern clans. "Name yourself, traveler. You ride toward a closed gate, and we do not open to strangers." "I am no stranger," Celine called back, "and that gate was built by my grandmother's hands." A pause. Movement on the wall. Murmured conversation. "Name yourself." "Celine of the Moonfang, daughter of Elindra. I am coming home." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to drop. Celine counted her heartbeats and watched the archers on the wall, and kept her hands visible and her spine straight, and waited. The gate opened. They rode through into a courtyard of packed snow and dark stone. 24 warriors stood in a loose semicircle, all women, all armed, all staring at Celine with expressions that ranged from shock to fury to something that might have been hunger. At the center of the group stood a woman in her 50s with white hair cropped short and a face like a hatchet, and one milky, blind eye that somehow managed to look more threatening than the functional one. "Thyra," Celine said. "Do not." The woman's voice was flat, dangerous. "Do not say my name as though you have the right to use it. You forfeited that right when you sold our crystal reserves to a Southland butcher and walked out of this gate like the 1,000 years behind you were nothing but an inconvenience. Thyra, your mother died waiting for you. Did you know that? She stood at this gate every winter solstice for 11 years watching the southern road. She told everyone you would come back. She said the mountain does not chase the river. She said it so many times it became a joke among the younger wolves. Poor old Elindra, still waiting for her traitor daughter. She died in her chair by the east window with her eyes on that road, and you are not here, and you do not get to ride through this gate now and say my name like we are sisters." Celine absorbed it, every word. She felt them land like stones against her ribs, each one precise, each one deserved. Her mother, dead, waiting. Watching a road she never came down. She filed the grief in the same locked compartment where she stored everything else she could not afford to feel right now, and met Thyra's one good eye. "You are right. I sold your future for a lie, and I do not deserve to be here. But my daughter is innocent. She carries Moonfang blood, and she has been poisoned, and she needs help that I cannot give her alone. So call me whatever you want. Spit on me if it helps, but let the girl inside before the cold takes what the poison has not." Thyra's eye moved to Lyra, still on horseback, shaking, barely upright. The hard lines of the old warrior's face shifted by a fraction. The child. "Lyra, my daughter. Elindra's granddaughter." "Yes." Thyra crossed to Lyra's horse in 3 strides. She reached up and pressed the back of her hand against the girl's forehead, then her throat, then the pulse point behind her ear. Her expression darkened. Night bloom. And something else. Bone wither, maybe. Who did this to her? Someone in the Wolf Kingdom court. I do not yet know who gave the order. But you have a guess. Celine said nothing. Thyra studied her face for a long moment, reading the silence the way Moonfang women read silences, as a language more honest than speech. "Bring the girl inside," Thyra said to the nearest warrior. "Take her to the healing rooms. Wake Elder Marin and tell her we have a night bloom case with a secondary toxin." She turned back to Celine. "The child gets treated. You and I are going to have a conversation that you are not going to enjoy." "I did not come here expecting to enjoy anything." "Good. Because the last time a Moonfang woman betrayed this clan, we buried her in the ice fields with her name struck from every record. The only reason I am not measuring your grave right now is because Elindra made me swear an oath on her deathbed that if you ever came back, I would hear you out before I decided whether to cut your throat. My mother always was more generous than I deserved. Your mother was the greatest alpha this clan has ever known. And you broke her heart so completely that she spent the last decade of her life pretending she did not have one." Thyra stepped close enough that Celine could smell the frost on her armor and the iron tang of old blood. "So talk, Celine. Tell me why I should not finish what you started 15 years ago and end the line of traitors right here in this courtyard." Celine looked at the woman who had trained her to fight before she could read, who had carried her on her shoulders through the ice caves when she was small, who had wept openly at the gate the day Celine left, and then apparently spent the next 15 years turning that grief into the kind of rage that does not cool. "Because you need me," Celine said. "We need nothing from you. You need everything from me. Your defenses are crumbling. The ice wards have been failing for years because you do not have enough Moonfang blood to sustain them. The beast hordes are pushing closer every season. Your warriors are half the number they were when I left, and your crystal reserves are gone because I took them. You are dying, Thyra. This whole place is dying. Slowly, quietly, the way proud things die when they refuse to admit they are wounded. And I am the wound. I did this, which means I am the only one who can undo it. Thyra's jaw tightened. The muscles in her neck corded. She wanted to argue. Celine could see the denial building behind her eye like a storm front. But Thyra was a warrior, not a politician, and warriors had a harder time lying to themselves because the truth in their world was measured in blood and bone and whether you were still standing at the end. You think you can just walk back in and rebuild what you destroyed. No. I think I can bleed for it, the way I should have bled 15 years ago. Bleeding is easy. Living with what you have done is harder. I know. I have been doing it every day since I left. They stared at each other across the snow-packed courtyard while the wind screamed overhead and the warriors watched in rigid silence, and somewhere inside the mountain, Lyra was being carried toward healers who might save her or might decide that the daughter of a traitor was not worth saving. Thyra spoke first. There is a council, 7 elders. They will decide your fate, not me. When? When I say so. Until then, you stay in the lower quarters. You do not speak to the warriors. You do not access the crystal chambers. And if your daughter survives the night, you do not tell her that her grandmother died in a chair by a window waiting for a woman who never came. Celine flinched. It was the first time she had shown anything other than iron control since crossing the border, and Thyra saw it, and the old warrior's expression did something complicated that was too layered to be satisfaction and too bitter to be sympathy. The lower quarters, Thyra repeated. Now, Celine dismounted. She handed the reins to the nearest warrior. She walked toward the mountain's interior without escort, because she still remembered every passage, every turn, every stone in this place that had been carved by her ancestors over 1,000 frozen years. She remembered the way the torchlight played across the obsidian walls. She remembered the sound the wind made when it found the ventilation shafts high above. She remembered the smell, iron and pine smoke, and the faint sweet mineral scent of crystal deposits deep in the rock. She remembered being a child here, running through these halls, believing she would spend her entire life within these walls, believing the mountain was the whole world and everything she needed was inside it. She had been right. She had just been too young and too stupid and too in love to know it. The lower quarters were a cell in everything but name, a small stone room with a narrow bed, a water basin, and no window. Celine sat on the bed and pressed her palms against her knees and stared at the wall and felt the full weight of 15 years of wrong choices settle onto her shoulders like a physical load, like armor made of regret. And she did not try to push it away because she had spent too long pushing things away, and all it had done was make them heavier. Somewhere above her, in the healing rooms, her daughter was fighting for her life for the second time in 4 days. Somewhere far to the south, in a palace she had stripped of its only real protection, the cracks in the barrier were widening. And somewhere in between, in the vast cold distance that separated what she had been from what she was becoming, Celine closed her eyes and let herself feel the one thing she had not allowed herself to feel since the night Kael spoke those words on the throne room floor. Not grief, not anger, not even hatred. Hope. It was small. It was fragile. It was barely a spark in the darkness. But it was hers, and it was alive, and it was the most dangerous thing she had carried out of the Wolf Kingdom, because a woman without hope can be controlled, and a woman without hope can be broken. But a woman who finds hope after she has already lost everything is a woman who will tear the world apart to keep it burning. A knock at the door. Thyra's voice stripped of everything but fact. The girl is stable. The healers neutralized the night bloom, but the secondary toxin has bonded to her bloodline at a level they have never seen before. It is not just poisoning her, Celine. It is rewriting her. Whatever was in that cup was designed to target Moonfang blood specifically. Celine's eyes opened. The hope in her chest did not die. It caught fire. Someone in the Wolf Kingdom knows what our bloodline can do, she said. Yes. And they did not just want to kill my daughter. They wanted to destroy the Moonfang line. Yes. Celine stood up from the bed. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even, and something behind her eyes had changed, something fundamental and irreversible, the last molecule of the woman she used to be burning away and leaving behind something harder and older and infinitely more patient. Call the council, Thyra. They will not be gentle. I do not need them to be gentle. I need them to listen. Because whoever engineered that poison did not act alone, and if they are targeting Moonfang blood, then this is not about me, and it is not about Kael, and it is not about a broken marriage. This is about someone trying to end a bloodline that has protected the northern world for 1,000 years. And you think the council will believe you, the traitor, the oathbreaker. I think the council will believe the poison in my daughter's veins. Bring them to the healing room. Let them see what was done to Alindra's grandchild, and then ask them if they still think the biggest threat to the Moonfang walked in through the front gate tonight. Thyra was still for a long time. The torchlight threw her shadow huge against the stone wall, a jagged silhouette of a woman whose entire life had been shaped by the betrayal of the person standing in front of her. Then she turned without a word and disappeared up the corridor. Celine stood alone in the cell and listened to the footsteps fade. Then she pressed her hand flat against the stone wall and felt it, faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable to anyone with Moonfang blood. The mountain was humming. Deep in its roots, in the crystal veins that threaded through the bedrock like a nervous system, something was stirring. Something that had been asleep for 15 years. Something that recognized the hand pressed against its skin. The mountain remembered her, and it was waking up. 700 miles to the south, the barrier over Dravenmoor flickered for the first time. A hairline fracture split the shimmering dome from east to west, invisible to the naked eye but screaming across every magical detection ward in the palace. In the war room, 3 court wizards stared at their instruments and began, very quietly, to panic. And in the eastern tower, in chambers that still smelled of jasmine and southern wine, Kael Draven slept with his hand resting on the pillow where Seraphine had lain and did not dream at all, because the barrier had always been someone else's problem, and the wife had always been someone else's sacrifice, and the daughter had always been someone else's blood. He would learn otherwise. But not tonight. Tonight, the cracks were still small enough to ignore, and Kael Draven had built his entire kingdom on the principle that anything small enough to ignore was not worth his attention. That principle was about to cost him everything he had left. The council chamber was carved into the deepest heart of the mountain, a circular room with 7 stone seats cut from the living rock and a floor inlaid with crystal veins that pulsed with a faint silver light, the residual energy of 1,000 years of Moonfang blood feeding the mountain's core. The ceiling was lost in darkness above. The air smelled of mineral dust and ancient cold, and the particular kind of silence that accumulates in places where difficult truths have been spoken for centuries. 7 elders sat in their seats, 7 faces, all women, all old, all carrying the particular hardness that comes from surviving decades in a frozen wasteland while the rest of the world forgot they existed. Thyra stood to the side with her arms crossed and her one good eye fixed on Celine like a hawk watching a rabbit decide whether to run. Celine stood in the center of the circle. She had not been offered a seat. She had not expected one. The eldest of the 7 was a woman named Era, 92 years old, blind in both eyes, with hands that looked like bundles of twisted rope, and a voice like gravel being crushed under a boot. She had been ancient when Celine was a child. She seemed to have aged sideways since then, not weaker, but denser, as though time had been compressing her into something harder and more concentrated with every passing year. Celine of the Moonfang. Era spoke without turning her blind eyes toward the sound. She did not need to. She had not needed sight in 40 years. Daughter of Alindra, Oathbreaker, Clan Seller, you stand before this council carrying the stink of the Wolf Kingdom on your skin and the blood of your mother's grief on your hands. State your purpose or state your last words. Either way, be brief. I have come to restore what I destroyed. What you destroyed cannot be restored. You gave our crystal reserves to Kael Draven, 20 generations of accumulated power drained in a single season to fuel a conqueror's war. You surrendered our warrior oaths, binding our finest fighters to a foreign king's service. 46 women left through that gate under your authority. 11 came back. The rest died in Draven's campaigns, fighting for a throne that was never ours. And you gave him the binding knowledge, the sacred techniques for channeling Moonfang blood into a defensive barrier. Knowledge that was never meant to leave this mountain. You did not just betray this clan, Celine. You hollowed us out and handed our bones to a wolf who used them for kindling. Celine took every word without flinching. Her body was still, her breathing was controlled, but her hands, hanging at her sides, had gone white at the knuckles, the tendons standing out like cables beneath the skin, because holding still while someone cataloged the exact dimensions of your sins was a form of endurance that no amount of queenly training could make painless. "Everything you say is true," she said. "Then why should we not end you here? Because ending me solves nothing. The damage is done. Killing me does not bring back the crystals or the warriors or the years my mother spent waiting. It gives you vengeance, and vengeance is a meal that fills the mouth but starves the belly. What I am offering you is something that actually feeds. And what is that? My blood. Freely given. Bound to this mountain for as long as I live. I will reopen the crystal veins. I will rebuild the ice wards. I will anchor the defenses the way my mother anchored them before me and her mother before her, not because I deserve to stand where they stood, but because my daughter carries this bloodline, and I will not let her inherit ashes." The council was silent. Celine watched the crystal veins in the floor pulse, faintly, erratically, the heartbeat of a mountain that was slowly dying for lack of the one thing she had taken from it. Elder Kira, the youngest of the 7 at 61, spoke next. Her voice was quieter than Era's, but carried a different kind of edge, not blunt force, but surgical precision. "You speak of your blood as though it is a gift, but your blood is already ours by birthright. The fact that you withheld it for 15 years while feeding it to a foreign kingdom is not generosity returning. It is theft ending. Call it whatever you want. The result is the same. The result is that we become dependent on you again. The woman who left once, offering to anchor our survival a second time. How do we know you will not simply leave again when a better offer arrives? Because there are no better offers. There never were. I was 19 and I was in love, and I mistook a man's hunger for devotion. That mistake cost me my mother, my clan, my daughter's safety, and 15 years of my life spent propping up a kingdom that treated me like furniture. I am not here because I have nowhere else to go. I am here because this is the only place that was ever real." The elders exchanged glances. Thyra shifted her weight against the wall. The silence stretched and thickened like ice forming over deep water. Era raised one gnarled hand. "We will deliberate. You will wait in the corridor. The child stays in the healing rooms until we decide whether her mother lives or dies." Celine turned and walked out of the chamber. The stone door closed behind her with a sound like a coffin lid settling into place. She leaned against the corridor wall, pressed her forehead to the cold rock, and allowed herself 3 breaths of weakness before she straightened and became iron again. She waited for 2 hours. The corridor was silent, except for the faint hum of the crystal veins in the walls and the distant echo of wind finding cracks in the mountain's skin far above. She did not pace. She did not sit. She stood with her back against the wall and her eyes open and her mind running calculations that had nothing to do with hope and everything to do with contingency, because she had learned a long time ago that hope without a backup plan was just another word for surrender. The door opened. Thyra stepped out. Her face was unreadable. "The council has decided. You will be given a trial period. 60 days. You will work to restore the crystal veins and the ice wards under supervision. If the mountain responds to your blood and the defenses show measurable improvement, you will be granted provisional status within the clan. Not as a daughter, not as an heir, as a servant. You will earn back your name 1 stone at a time, or you will not earn it back at all. And Lyra? The child will be treated and protected regardless of your standing. She is Elindra's blood. The council does not punish children for their mother's sins." Something unlocked behind Celine's ribs. Not relief exactly. More like the release of a pressure she had been carrying so long she had forgotten it was there. "I accept." "You accept because you have no choice." "I accept because it is fair." Thyra studied her for a long moment. "You have changed." "No. I have just stopped pretending I had not already changed a long time ago." The first weeks were brutal. Celine descended into the crystal chambers every morning before dawn and did not emerge until well after dark. The chambers were vast, a network of natural caverns threaded with crystal formations that had been cultivated by Moonfang women for over a millennium, each vein carefully fed and maintained and coaxed into alignment with the mountain's deep geological energy. Or at least they had been. 15 years of neglect had left them fractured, dim, whole sections gone dark where the crystals had cracked, and the energy had bled out into the surrounding rock like water soaking into sand. Celine worked with her bare hands. The restoration required direct contact, skin against crystal, blood against stone, the ancient Moonfang technique of feeding your own life force into the mineral lattice and coaxing it back to coherence. It was exhausting in a way that went far beyond physical fatigue. Each session left her drained, hollowed out, as though something essential had been siphoned from her core. She would climb the stairs afterward on legs that trembled and collapse onto her narrow bed and sleep like the dead until the next morning when she would rise and do it all over again. Lyra recovered faster than anyone expected. Within 10 days, the girl was walking the mountain's corridors under the watchful eye of the Moonfang healers, her color returning, her appetite sharpening, that fierce golden light reigniting in her eyes. The healers reported that the night bloom had been fully neutralized, but that the secondary toxin, the one Thyra had identified as possible bone wither, was behaving in ways they had never seen. It was not destroying the Moonfang markers in Lyra's bloodline. It was activating them, violently, unpredictably. As though someone had designed the poison not merely to kill, but to force a metamorphosis, to crack open something that was supposed to awaken naturally over decades and blow it wide open all at once. Celine filed that information in the same locked room where she kept everything too dangerous to examine in daylight. By the 4th week, the mountain was visibly responding. Crystal veins that had been dark for years began to glow again, faintly at first, then with increasing steadiness. Silver light threading through the stone, like blood returning to a limb that had been tourniquet cut for too long. The ice wards along the outer walls began to regenerate. The beast hordes that had been encroaching on the Moonfang borders for years suddenly found themselves hitting resistance they had not encountered in a decade and a half. The warriors noticed. The elders noticed. Thyra noticed. Nobody thanked Celine. She did not expect them to. On the 37th day, everything fell apart. Celine was in the deep chambers, alone, 300 feet below the surface, her palms pressed against the largest crystal formation in the mountain, a pillar of raw moonstone 10 feet in diameter that served as the central nexus for the entire defensive network. She was deep in the trance state that the work required. Her consciousness spread thin across the crystal lattice, feeling every node and junction and fracture point in the network like a spider feeling vibrations on a web. That was why she felt it before anyone else. A disturbance at the gate. Not an attack. Something worse. The energy signature of someone carrying Moonfang blood arriving at the mountain's entrance, but wrong, twisted. The familiar frequency bent into a shape that made Celine's teeth ache and her vision blur. She pulled her hands from the crystal and ran. She climbed 300 feet of spiral stairs in the dark, lungs burning, legs screaming, the cold air tearing at her throat. She burst through the upper chambers and into the main corridor and nearly collided with Thyra, who was moving in the opposite direction with a drawn blade and murder on her face. "What is happening?" Riders at the gate. 3 of them. They are carrying a Moonfang banner. "That is impossible. There are no Moonfang outside this mountain." "There are now, and one of them is asking for you by name." They reached the courtyard as the gate opened. 3 riders entered. Their horses were lathered and trembling, pushed beyond endurance. The riders themselves were wrapped in heavy cloaks, hoods drawn, faces hidden. The lead rider dismounted and pulled back her hood. Celine stopped breathing. The woman was young, mid-20s, with the sharp bone structure and silver-streaked dark hair that marked Moonfang blood as clearly as a brand. She was tall, lean, with the hard, rangy build of someone who had spent years fighting and traveling and sleeping in places that were not beds. Her eyes were pale gray, almost colorless, and they found Celine across the courtyard with the precision of an arrow finding a target. "Hello, Mother." The word detonated in the silence like a stone dropped into still water. Thyra's head snapped toward Celine. The courtyard warriors froze. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. Celine's vision narrowed. The edges of the courtyard went dark. She could hear her own blood roaring in her ears, a sound like a river breaking through a dam. And behind it, deeper, the low grinding noise of something she had buried so deep and so completely that she had convinced herself it no longer existed. "That is not possible," she whispered. "And yet—" The young woman spread her arms. "Here I am!" Thyra stepped forward. Her blade was still drawn. "Explain, now!" The woman kept her eyes on Celine. "You want to tell them, or should I? I admit I have rehearsed this conversation enough times that I would hate to waste the material." Celine could not speak. Her mouth was open, but nothing came out. Her hands were shaking. Not the controlled tremor she could clamp down and hide, but a full-body vibration that started in her chest and radiated outward until even her jaw was rattling. The young woman sighed. "Fine, I will do it." She turned to face the assembled warriors, raising her voice so it carried to every corner of the courtyard. "My name is Ravenna. I was born 24 years ago in the south, 3 years before Princess Lyra, to a woman named Selene of the Moonfang and a man named Kael Draven. My mother gave me up at birth, handed me to a midwife with a bag of silver and instructions to take me somewhere I would never be found. She did this because she was not yet queen, and a bastard child would have ruined her path to the throne." The silence in the courtyard was not silence anymore. It was a void, a negative space where sound should have been, an absence so complete it had its own weight and its own temperature, and it was very, very cold. Thyra turned to look at Celine. The expression on the old warrior's face was something Celine had never seen before and never wanted to see again. A look of absolute and total recalibration. The look of someone whose understanding of another person has just been demolished down to the foundation and rebuilt into something unrecognizable. "Is this true?" Celine closed her eyes. When she opened them, the shaking had stopped. Something had gone very still inside her, the way a body goes still when it has exhausted every possible escape route and arrives at the place where the only remaining option is the truth. "Yes." The single word fell into the courtyard and shattered against the stone. "Yes. Before Lyra. Before the crown. I carried a child and I gave her away because Kael did not know, and I could not let him know. He wanted a pure heir. He spoke of bloodline strength, of the perfect union between Draven and Moonfang, and he made it clear that any child born outside the formal bond would be a weakness, a liability, a threat to the legitimacy of whatever dynasty we built. I was 20 years old. I was already in too deep. I had already given the crystals and the warriors and the oaths, and there was no path back. So I did the one thing I have never been able to forgive myself for. I let her go. Ravenna's face did not change during this speech. She listened the way a woman listens to a story she already knows, checking it for accuracy, noting the places where it aligned with the version she had been told and the places where it diverged. "You forgot the part where you never came looking," Ravenna said. "I did not forget. In 24 years, not once. Not once. Were you afraid Kael would find out, or were you just relieved I was gone?" "Both. And I will carry that for the rest of my life." Ravenna smiled. It was not Selene's smile or Kael's smile. It was something entirely her own, cold and bright, and edged like a blade that has been sharpened so many times the metal has gone thin. "You will carry more than that," Ravenna said. "I did not come here for a reunion. I came here to tell you that the poison in Lyra's cup was mine." Every warrior in the courtyard drew their weapons simultaneously. The sound of 24 blades leaving their sheaths was like a single sharp exhale of steel. Ravenna did not flinch. She stood in the center of the killing circle with her hands at her sides and her chin raised and her pale eyes steady. "Not the Nightbloom," she continued, her voice even, almost conversational. "That was Seraphine's work. She has been planning to remove Lyra since the day she returned to Dravenmoor. But the secondary compound, the one your healers cannot identify, the one that is rewriting your daughter's blood as we speak, that was mine. I designed it. I synthesized it. And I added it to Seraphine's poison because Seraphine is a fool who wanted a dead princess, and I wanted something far more useful." "What did you want?" Celine's voice came from somewhere she did not recognize, a place beneath the shock, beneath the guilt, beneath the 15 layers of denial that were collapsing inside her like floors in a burning building. "I wanted to wake up the bloodline. Not in Lyra, in the mountain, in you. The compound I created is a catalyst. It bonds to Moonfang blood and accelerates dormant markers by a factor of 50. When Lyra drank it, her blood screamed loud enough that every crystal vein within 500 miles heard it, including the ones in this mountain, including the ones that have been sleeping since you left. Why do you think the mountain started responding to you so fast? You thought it was your hands in the crystal chamber, your sacrifice, your redemption. It was not. It was Lyra's blood calling from the healing room above, priming the lattice, doing in weeks what would have taken you years. Celine felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Not physically, but the architecture of everything she had believed about the last 5 weeks, the narrative she had constructed about earning back her place, about the mountain recognizing her, about penance and restoration, and the slow rebuilding of what she had destroyed. All of it tilted and restructured around a new center of gravity that was standing in front of her with her own eyes in a stranger's face. You poisoned your own sister to jumpstart a mountain. I poisoned a half-sister I have never met to save a bloodline that the Wolf Kingdom is actively trying to exterminate. Seraphine is not acting alone. She is a weapon. Someone in Kael's inner circle is systematically targeting Moonfang blood because they know the barrier depends on it, and they know the mountain depends on it, and they know that if both fall, the northern defenses collapse, and every beast horde on this continent pours south through the gap. I have spent 6 years tracking this conspiracy. I have killed 4 people to stay alive long enough to get here. And I did not do any of it because I love this family, because this family threw me away like a defective litter runt. I did it because if the Moonfang bloodline dies, the Frozen Reach falls. And if the Frozen Reach falls, every human settlement north of the Grey March is meat. Thyra had not lowered her blade. You admit to poisoning a child under our protection. I admit to everything. I am not here to be forgiven. I am here because my mother abandoned me and my father does not know I exist, and my sister is carrying a compound in her veins that will either make her the most powerful Moonfang in 1,000 years or kill her within 6 months, and I am the only person alive who knows which way it will go. Celine stared at the daughter she had given away. She stared at the face that was half hers and half Kael's and entirely its own. She stared at the future standing in front of her disguised as the past, and she understood with a clarity that felt like frostbite, sharp and burning and absolutely irreversible, that every choice she had ever made, every sacrifice, every betrayal, every desperate midnight escape had led here, to this courtyard, to this moment, to this impossible girl who had turned Celine's attempt at redemption into ashes, and was now offering her something far more terrifying than a second chance. The truth. Thyra looked at Celine. Orders, Queen? It was the first time anyone in the Moonfang had called her that since she returned. It was the worst possible moment for it, because the title landed on her shoulders at the exact instant she realized she had no idea what to do with it. The woman who had walked out of Dravenmoor with a plan was gone. The woman who had knelt before the council and offered her blood in penance was gone. In their place stood someone she did not recognize yet, someone who was being forged in real time by the heat of a revelation she could not outrun, and that someone had about 30 seconds to decide what kind of leader she was going to be before the warriors in this courtyard made the decision for her. She looked at Ravenna, at the daughter she threw away who had come back as a weapon, at the girl who had poisoned her sister to save a mountain, at the woman whose eyes held no warmth and no mercy and no need for the mother who had never earned the right to be one. She looked at Thyra, at the blade still drawn, at the warriors still poised to kill. She looked at the mountain beneath her feet, humming with stolen energy, alive because a girl she had given up had put poison in a cup and changed the rules of everything. Then she looked at her own hands, the hands that had healed, the hands that had held, the hands that had signed away a clan and carried a dying daughter and pressed themselves into crystal and tried, again and again, to build something that could survive her own mistakes. Those hands were not shaking anymore. Disarm her, Celine said. Take her companions into custody. Separate them. I want her in the interrogation chamber within the hour. No one speaks to her before I do. And then, Celine looked at Ravenna one final time. The girl looked back. Between them lay 24 years of silence and a chasm that no apology could bridge, and a choice that was going to require Celine to become someone she had never been before. Not a wife, not a mother, not a queen playing at redemption, but something older and colder and more honest than any of those masks had ever allowed her to be. And then, Celine said, I am going to find out exactly who is hunting our bloodline, and I am going to end them, every last one. Ravenna smiled that thin, bright blade of a smile as the warriors closed around her. Now she sounds like a moonfang. The interrogation chamber was a room that the moonfang had carved specifically for the purpose of making people uncomfortable. It sat at the junction of two ventilation shafts, which meant the air moved constantly, cold currents cutting across the space from unpredictable angles, making it impossible to settle, impossible to relax, impossible to forget for even a second that you were inside a mountain that had been designed by women who understood that discomfort was the fastest route to honesty. Ravenna sat on a stone chair with her wrists bound to iron rings bolted into the armrests. She did not look uncomfortable. She looked like a woman who had been tied to worse things in worse places and had learned to treat restraints as furniture. Celine stood across from her. Between them was a stone table, empty except for a single oil lamp that threw their shadows huge and trembling against the walls. Thyra was positioned near the door, with her blade sheathed but her hand resting on the pommel, a posture that communicated readiness without commitment, the body language of a woman who could transition from still to lethal in the space between heartbeats. Celine studied Ravenna's face in the lamplight. The resemblance was worse up close, not identical, sharper. Celine saw her own cheekbones but cut at steeper angles, her own jawline but stripped of softness, Kael's brow ridge sitting heavy over those pale gray eyes that belonged to neither parent and seemed to have been generated by the collision between them, something new forged in the impact. "Start from the beginning," Celine said. "Which beginning? The one where you handed me to a midwife and walked away, or the one that is actually useful?" "The useful one." Ravenna leaned back as far as the restraints allowed. 6 years ago, I was living in the border town of Ashwick, working as a tracker for a mercenary company, hunting beasts, escorting caravans, the kind of work that pays enough to keep you fed and not enough to keep you comfortable. One night, a man showed up at our camp, well-dressed, southern accent, hands that had never held anything heavier than a pen. He was recruiting, said he represented an organization that was interested in people with unusual bloodlines, specifically Moonfang descendants living outside the clan. What organization? He called it the Pale Hand. I thought he was lying. Organizations with dramatic names are usually 3 men in a basement with delusions of relevance. But he knew things. He knew my blood markers. He knew my lineage. He knew details about the Moonfang crystal network that should have been impossible for an outsider to possess. So I played along, accepted his offer, let them bring me inside. And what did you find? Ravenna's expression shifted. The sharp amusement drained out of it, replaced by something flat and controlled, the face of someone reviewing memories that had left marks. I found a network, embedded in the Wolf Kingdom's aristocracy, funded by noble houses that had been quietly positioning themselves for years. Their goal was simple: destroy the Moonfang bloodline entirely, not out of hatred, out of strategy. They understood what Kael never bothered to learn, that the barrier protecting Dravenmoor and the ice wards protecting the north are both dependent on living Moonfang blood. Remove the blood, the defenses fall. The defenses fall, the beast hordes flood south. And in the chaos of an invasion, the current power structure collapses, and the noble houses who positioned themselves correctly get to rebuild the kingdom in their own image. Who leads it? That is where it gets interesting. Ravenna's eyes found Celine's and held them. The Pale Hand has operated for over a decade. Someone has been feeding them detailed intelligence about Moonfang bloodline mechanics, crystal resonance patterns, the specific frequencies needed to disrupt the barrier. That kind of knowledge does not come from research. It comes from direct experience, from someone who has personally worked with the crystals, someone who understood the binding techniques at an intimate level. The cold in the room deepened, not from the ventilation shafts, from something else entirely. "You're saying the source is Moonfang," Celine said. "I am saying the source is someone who had access to the deepest secrets of this clan and then left it and went south." Ravenna's voice was very quiet. The Pale Hand's intelligence files reference a primary source they call the Architect. The Architect provided them with everything: crystal schematics, bloodline vulnerability maps, the exact composition needed for a poison that could target Moonfang markers. All of it delivered over a period of roughly 15 years, starting almost exactly from the date you arrived in Dravenmoor. Thyra's hand tightened on her blade. Celine's body went still in a way that had nothing to do with composure and everything to do with the particular paralysis that occurs when the mind encounters information so catastrophic that it needs a moment to decide whether to process it or reject it entirely. You're accusing me. I'm telling you what the files say. I never provided intelligence to anyone, not knowingly, but you worked the crystals beneath Dravenmoor for 15 years. You maintained the barrier, you operated the binding techniques nightly, and every single night the palace crystal chamber was connected to the kingdom's wider resonance network, a network that the Pale Hand had been tapping for over a decade, siphoning data directly from the crystal lattice while you fed it. You were not the traitor, Celine. You were the tap. The lamp flame guttered. Shadows jumped. Celine stood motionless in the shifting dark and felt something restructure inside her chest. A realignment of understanding so fundamental that it changed the shape of everything she had believed about her own story. She had spent 15 years thinking she was the one keeping the kingdom alive. She had carried that knowledge like a secret badge of worth, proof that even if Kael did not value her, the kingdom itself needed her. Every night in that crystal chamber had been an act of quiet defiance, proof that she mattered even when no one knew it. And every night, without knowing, she had been feeding the enemy the exact information they needed to destroy the very thing she was trying to protect. How? Her voice was stripped bare. No queen in it, no iron, just the raw scrape of a woman whose foundations had just been dynamited. How did they tap the lattice without me sensing it? Because the tap was installed before you ever arrived. It was built into the Dravenmoor crystals when they were first placed. Your crystals, by the way, the ones you took from this mountain and gave to Kael. Whoever designed the Pale Hand strategy did it from the start. They knew you would hand over the crystals. They knew Kael would install them. And they knew that eventually a Moonfang would be maintaining the barrier and feeding the lattice with everything the organization needed to map the bloodline's weaknesses. That is impossible. Nobody could have predicted that 15 years in advance. Nobody predicted it. Somebody planned it. Somebody engineered the entire sequence. Your romance with Kael, the war, the crystal transfer, all of it. Celine's breath stopped. She felt it catch in her throat like a physical blockage, a chunk of understanding too large to swallow. She forced it down. She forced air into her lungs. She forced her hands to unclench from the fists they had formed without her permission. You are saying my marriage was a setup. I am saying it was the opening move in a very long game, and you were the piece they needed on the board. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, pressurized, a silence that contained the weight of 15 years of sacrifice suddenly recontextualized as 15 years of manipulation. A life story rewritten in real time from the inside out. The protagonist discovering that she had never been the protagonist at all, but the mechanism by which the actual story had been operating. Celine turned to Thyra. The old warrior's face was pale, the scar tissue around her blind eye standing out white against skin that had gone gray. Double the perimeter guard. Send scouts south along the Gray March. I want to know if anything is moving toward this mountain. You believe her? I believe the poison in Lyra's blood. I believe the barrier falling. I believe that someone has been 10 steps ahead of every decision I've ever made, and the only way that is possible is if those decisions were never really mine to begin with. Believe her or do not. The tactical response is the same. Thyra left. Celine turned back to Ravenna. The poison you put in Lyra's wine. The catalyst compound. If it was designed to activate her bloodline, then whoever created the formula understood Moonfang blood at a molecular level. You said you synthesized it yourself. I did. Where did you learn the biochemistry? From the Pale Hand's own research. I spent 4 years inside their organization. They had laboratories, alchemists, resources that would make the Wolf Kingdom's court physicians look like village herbalists. They were not just studying the Moonfang bloodline, they were reverse engineering it, trying to find a way to sever the connection between blood and crystal permanently. A way to kill the mountain without having to kill every person carrying the markers. Did they succeed? They were close. 6 months ago, I stole their primary research archive and burned their main laboratory. That is when I became a target. 3 of my contacts were dead within a week. I've been running ever since. And you came here. I came here because this is where it ends. Not the Pale Hand. Not the conspiracy. All of it. The mountain, the bloodline. The 1,000-year game that our family has been playing without knowing the rules. It ends here because in approximately 4 weeks, the compound in Lyra's blood will reach full activation. When it does, she will either become the anchor this mountain needs to survive the next century, or the energy surge will kill her and crack the mountain's crystal core, and there will be nothing left to protect. Celine's vision tunneled. The room shrank to a pinpoint of lamplight and her daughter's face and the cold calculus of a countdown she had not known was running. You gave my daughter a coin flip between power and death. I gave your daughter a chance, which is more than you gave me. The words hit their mark. Celine absorbed the impact without flinching because she had used up her flinches hours ago, and there was nothing left but the bare architecture of a woman who was rapidly discovering that the structure she had spent her entire life building had been constructed on someone else's blueprints. 4 weeks, she said. Less. The activation is accelerating. Lyra's body temperature has been climbing steadily. Your healers have noticed. They think it is residual fever. It is not. It is her blood generating energy faster than her body can contain. If we do not find a way to channel that energy safely into the mountain's crystal lattice before it reaches critical mass, it will burn her alive from the inside. Celine pressed her palms flat against the stone table. She leaned forward until the lamplight carved her face into planes of shadow and bone and the raw topography of a woman who had just been handed the worst possible information at the worst possible time and was choosing, consciously, deliberately, to convert the terror into fuel. What do you need? Access to the deep crystal chamber, the central nexus, the pillar you have been working on. Lyra needs to be connected directly to the lattice so the energy has somewhere to go. But the connection has to be precise. Too fast and it shatters the crystals. Too slow and it does not draw enough to prevent the overload. I can calibrate the compound. I can control the rate. But I need your blood in the lattice simultaneously to stabilize the flow. You need me to anchor while Lyra channels. I need you to catch her if she falls, the same way you caught her the night she was poisoned. Except this time, if you lose your grip, neither of you is coming back. Celine straightened. She looked at this daughter she had abandoned, this weapon she had forged through neglect, the stranger who had walked out of the wilderness carrying answers wrapped in poison and ultimatums. She looked and she did not see herself or Kael or the mistakes she had made 24 years ago. She saw the future, brutal, unsentimental, refusing to wait for anyone to be ready for it. Thyra will never allow you near the deep chambers. Then you will have to convince her. She does not trust you. She should not. I poisoned a child. I infiltrated an enemy organization and killed people and stole secrets and manipulated a bloodline catalyst into a 14-year-old ceremonial wine. I am not trustworthy. I am useful. And right now, useful is the only thing that is going to keep your daughter alive. Celine did not answer immediately. She stood in the cold, flickering light and ran the calculations one more time, looking for an alternative, a safer path, a version of this situation where she did not have to bet everything she had left on the word of a daughter she had thrown away who had every reason in the world to want her dead. There was no alternative. There was no safer path. There was only the choice between acting on incomplete information or standing still while the clock ran out, and Celine had spent 15 years standing still, and it had cost her everything, and she was done. I will speak to the council. I will get you access, but you will be under guard at all times, and if at any point I believe you are a threat to Lyra, I will kill you myself, daughter or not. I would expect nothing less from a Moonfang. Do not call me that. I have not earned it back yet. Ravenna tilted her head. Something shifted in those pale eyes, too fast to identify, gone before it could be named. You know the interesting thing about the Pale Hands files, the intelligence they collected on every living Moonfang descendant? My file was 3 pages, clinical, blood markers, location history, threat assessment. Your file was 47 pages, and on the last page, in a handwriting I eventually identified as the architect's own, there was a single annotation. It said, "She is the one we cannot control, not Kael, not the council, not the warriors. You. They have been afraid of you for 15 years, Celine, the woman they spent a decade manipulating, the piece they thought they had positioned perfectly, and they are still afraid of her. That should tell you something. It tells me they are smarter than my husband. It tells you that whatever they built their plan on, they always knew there was a variable they could not account for, a woman who was supposed to be broken but was not. A piece that was supposed to stay where they put it, but moved. They designed every element of this game except the one thing that matters most. They did not design you, and that terrifies them. Celine turned toward the door. She stopped with her hand on the iron frame. 4 weeks. Possibly less. Then we start tomorrow. She walked out of the interrogation chamber and into the corridor and leaned against the wall and tasted blood where she had bitten through the inside of her cheek without realizing it. The copper taste filled her mouth. She swallowed it. She breathed through it. She pushed off the wall and walked toward the healing rooms because her daughter was sleeping and she needed to see her breathing and she needed to count the breaths and she needed the rhythm of that counting to hold her together for a few more hours until the sun came up and the work began. Lyra was asleep when Celine entered. The girl's cheeks were flushed. Her skin was warm to the touch, warmer than it should have been. And now that Celine knew what to look for, she could feel it, a subtle vibration running through Lyra's body, the hum of energy building in blood that was being rewritten from the inside, a clock ticking down in the marrow of her only surviving daughter. She sat beside the bed. She took Lyra's hand. She did not speak. 200 miles to the south, the barrier over Dravenmoor failed for the first time. A section of the eastern wall simply ceased to exist, the shimmering energy winking out like a candle flame pinched between wet fingers. The gap lasted 11 seconds before the residual crystal charge surged to fill it. 11 seconds. Long enough for the scout perched on the ridge beyond the wall to see straight through into the heart of the capital. Long enough for the message to be sent. In a room that smelled of old paper and alchemical residue, in a location that appeared on no map and answered to no king, a figure read the message by candlelight. The figure's hands were steady. The figure's breathing was even. On the desk beside the message sat a file, 47 pages, annotated in neat handwriting. The final page was open. She is the one we cannot control. The figure picked up a pen and added a single line beneath the annotation, pressing hard enough that the nib scored the paper. Then we remove her from the board. The pen was set down. The candle guttered. And somewhere in the vast machinery of a conspiracy that had been running longer than anyone alive fully understood, a final sequence was set into motion, irreversible, aimed at the heart of a mountain where a woman sat holding her daughter's hand and listening to her breathe, and did not know that the enemy she had just discovered was already closer than she could possibly imagine. Inside the mountain, the crystal veins pulsed, once, twice, then faster, brighter, responding to something they had not felt in 1,000 years. The resonance of 2 Moonfang bloodlines burning in close proximity, mother and daughter, anchor and catalyst, the beginning of something that would either save the northern world or shatter it beyond all repair. The countdown had begun, and the mountain was holding its breath. They had 19 days. Ravenna said 19. The healers said 22. Celine split the difference and planned for 17 because every timeline she had ever been given by someone else had turned out to be a lie, and she was done building her life on other people's estimates. The preparation consumed the mountain. Celine worked the deep crystal chamber 18 hours a day, expanding the lattice connections she had spent the previous weeks rebuilding, widening the channels, reinforcing the pathways that would need to carry the surge of energy when Lyra connected. It was like preparing a riverbed for a flood she could feel coming but could not yet see, digging deeper, building the banks higher, knowing that if she miscalculated by even a fraction, the water would drown everything. Ravenna worked alongside her under armed guard. 2 Moonfang warriors stood at the chamber entrance at all times, blades drawn, watching Ravenna the way you watch a snake you have been told is necessary but cannot bring yourself to trust. Ravenna ignored them with the practiced indifference of someone who had spent years being watched by people who wanted her dead and had learned to treat surveillance as background noise. The 2 women did not speak except when the work demanded it. There was too much between them for conversation and not enough time for the kind of reckoning that their history required. So they worked in silence, mother and abandoned daughter, their hands moving across the crystal formations in parallel rhythms that were eerily synchronized despite the 24 years of distance. Because blood remembers what the mind forgets, and the crystals did not care about the emotional wreckage of the women feeding them. On the 12th day, Lyra's temperature spiked to a level that made the healers white-faced. The girl was conscious, lucid, but burning from the inside. Her skin had taken on a faint luminescence, a silver-white glow visible in dim light. And when she pressed her hand against the stone walls of her room, The crystal veins nearby pulsed in response, brightening, reaching toward her like roots seeking water. Celine brought Lyra to the deep chamber that night. The girl needed to see it, needed to understand what was going to happen to her. The central nexus pillar rose from the chamber floor like a frozen column of moonlight, 10 feet of raw crystal humming with the accumulated energy of 1,000 years and the 5 weeks of Celine's blood. Lyra stood before it with her glowing hands at her sides and her golden eyes wide in the expression of a child standing at the edge of a cliff, trying to decide if the water below is deep enough to survive the fall. "It is loud," Lyra said. "I can hear it in my chest, like a second heartbeat. That is the lattice. It is resonating with your blood. It hurts. I know. Does it hurt you too?" "Every time." Lyra was quiet for a moment. She reached out and touched the pillar with her fingertips. The crystal blazed white where her skin made contact, a flash so bright that Celine threw her arm across her eyes, and the two guards stumbled backward. When the light faded, there was a handprint burned into the crystal surface, glowing silver, perfectly detailed, every line and whirl of Lyra's fingers etched into the mineral lattice like a signature written in fire. "I am not afraid," Lyra said. She was trembling. Her voice was thin. She was absolutely terrified. "I am not afraid, Mama." "You are allowed to be afraid. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that something else matters more." "What matters more?" Celine looked at her daughter in the crystal light. 14 years old, poisoned, hunted, uprooted, carried across a frozen wilderness by a mother who had waited 15 years too long to leave, standing in the heart of a mountain that was asking her to pour herself into it without any guarantee that there would be enough of her left when it was done. "You do," Celine said, "surviving this, growing up, becoming whoever you decide to be on the other side. That matters more than being afraid." Lyra nodded. She pulled her hand from the crystal, and the glow faded, and she looked up at her mother with those golden wolf eyes and said something that nearly broke Celine's composure for the first time in weeks. "If I do not make it through, do not blame Ravenna. She did what she thought was right. That is more than most people manage." Celine stared at her. "How do you know about Ravenna?" "Sound carries in a mountain, Mama, and I am not a child anymore." On the 17th day, the scouts Thyra had sent south returned at a dead gallop. Their report was brief and devastating. A force was moving north through the Grey March, not beast hordes, not Wolf Kingdom soldiers. Something else. 200 fighters in unmarked armor carrying weapons that pulsed with a sickly amber light, the signature of corrupted crystal technology. They were moving fast, in tight formation, with the disciplined precision of professionals who knew exactly where they were going. The Pale Hand. Thyra brought the report to Celine in the deep chamber. The old warrior's face was a mask of controlled fury. 2 days, 3 at most before they reached the gate. How did they find us? They have always known where we are. The lattice tap you were feeding for 15 years gave them the mountain's exact coordinates. They were waiting for the right moment. And the right moment is now, when the bloodline is vulnerable, when Lyra is mid-activation and cannot be moved. Yes. Celine leaned against the crystal pillar. She pressed her forehead to the cool mineral surface and listened to the hum of the lattice and felt the impossible weight of a situation that had been engineered by enemies. She still could not fully see, closing around her from every direction simultaneously, leaving her trapped between a daughter who would die if the ritual was delayed and an army that would kill them all if it was not. She had 17 days of preparation for a process that needed 22. She had a mountain garrison of 60 warriors against 200 trained operatives. She had a poisoned daughter, an abandoned daughter she could not fully trust, a council that still considered her a traitor, and exactly 0 options that did not involve sacrificing something she could not afford to lose. She closed her eyes. She breathed. And in the darkness behind her eyelids, in the space where fear and calculation and the raw animal need to protect her children all converged into a single point of terrible clarity, Celine made a choice. "We do it tonight." Thyra stiffened. "The activation is not ready. You said yourself the channels need more time." "We do not have more time. If the Pale Hand breaches this mountain during the ritual, they will disrupt the lattice and Lyra dies. If we wait for them to arrive and fight first, Lyra's blood reaches critical mass without a channel, and she dies. The only window is now. Tonight. Before they get here." The lattice is at 70% capacity. If Lyra channels full power through an incomplete network, the overload could crack the central pillar. Then I will hold the difference. Thyra went very still. You cannot absorb 30% of a bloodline activation surge. No single anchor has ever channeled that much energy and survived. My mother did. During the Great Breach, 40 years ago, she held the lattice together alone for 3 days while the crystal veins were repaired. The elders told me the story when I was 6 years old, and I have never forgotten a single detail. Your mother nearly died. She lost the use of her legs for 2 years. And the mountain survived, and the breach was sealed, and the Moonfang endured because one woman decided that the cost to herself was less important than the cost of failure. I am my mother's daughter, Thyra. It took me 35 years and the worst mistakes a woman can make to figure that out. But I know it now. Thyra looked at her for a long time. The torchlight played across the old warrior's scarred face, and for the first time since Celine had returned, something in Thyra's expression softened. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But recognition. The acknowledgement of something familiar in the woman standing in front of her. A stubbornness. A willingness to bleed. A specific flavor of insanity that Thyra had last seen in the eyes of Celine's mother on the worst night of the Great Breach. The night Elindra had pressed her palms against the central pillar and held the mountain together through sheer force of will and bloodline fury, and the absolute refusal to let the thing she loved most in this world fall apart on her watch. I will prepare the garrison, Thyra said. We hold the gate. We buy you as much time as we can. You will have the mountain's defenses. Once the lattice is active, the ice wards will respond. Use them. And if you die in there? Then Ravenna takes over as anchor. She has Moonfang blood. It is thinner than mine, but it will hold long enough for Lyra to stabilize. You trust her with that? I trust that she wants to survive, and survival is the most honest motivation there is. Thyra nodded once. She turned to leave. At the door, she stopped. Your mother would be proud of you tonight. My mother would call me a fool. Same thing, in Moonfang. Thyra left. The ritual began at sundown. The deep chamber was cleared of everyone except Celine, Lyra, and Ravenna. 3 women carrying the same blood standing in a circle around the central pillar, the crystal light turning their faces silver in shadow. Lyra was glowing. The luminescence that had been faint days ago was now visible even in the bright crystal light, a silver fire burning just beneath her skin, visible in the veins of her hands, the pulse points of her throat, the thin skin of her temples where the blood ran close to the surface. She was shaking. Her temperature was dangerously high. She had maybe hours before the energy tore her apart. Ravenna stood to Celine's left, with her hands unbound for the first time since her arrival. The council had debated this for 40 minutes. Thyra had ended the debate by slamming her fist on the table and saying that Celine's daughter was going to die in a crystal chamber, and if anyone wanted to argue about restraints, they could do it with her blade. Nobody argued. The process is simple, Ravenna said. Her voice was clinical, stripped of emotion, the voice of an alchemist describing a procedure. Lyra places her hands on the pillar. The compound in her blood will activate on contact with the central nexus. Energy transfers into the lattice. I modulate the rate. You anchor the flow and absorb the excess. If the lattice holds, the energy distributes through the mountain's crystal network, and the activation completes safely. If it does not hold, the energy rebounds and we all die in roughly 4 seconds. That is reassuring, Lyra said. Ravenna glanced at her. Something crossed her face, fast and unguarded, gone in an instant. She had not spoken directly to Lyra before this moment, had not allowed herself to look at the sister she had poisoned, the sister who carried the same blood, the sister who had grown up in a palace with a mother and a name and everything Ravenna had been denied. Whatever she felt about that, she had locked it away in the same iron compartment where she kept everything else that might interfere with the work. Ready? Ravenna asked. Celine placed her palms on the pillar. The crystal hummed against her skin, familiar now, almost warm. She felt the lattice spread out beneath her consciousness, a vast network of connections and channels, and the spaces where channels should have been, but were not, the 30% gap that was going to cost her something she could not yet calculate. Ready, she said. Lyra stepped forward. She looked at her mother across the pillar's surface. 14 years old, silver fire in her veins. The courage of a child pretending she was not terrified because her mother had taught her that pretending was the first step toward the real thing. I love you, Mama. I love you too. Now put your hands on the crystal and trust your blood. Lyra pressed her palms against the pillar. The world went white. The surge hit Celine like a wall of molten silver, a tidal wave of raw bloodline energy pouring through the lattice with a force that she had known intellectually would be enormous but had not been prepared to feel in her actual body. Her vision blanked. Her hearing collapsed into a roar like a river breaking through a dam. Every nerve in her hands and arms and chest and spine ignited simultaneously, and for one horrible second she was certain she had miscalculated, certain the lattice was going to shatter, certain she was about to die 300 feet underground, holding a crystal pillar while her daughters watched. Then the Moonfang blood in her veins answered the surge, and the calculus changed. It was not strength. It was not power. It was stubbornness. The same stubbornness that had kept her standing on the palace steps when Kale brought Seraphine home. The same stubbornness that had kept her feeding the barrier every night for 15 years without acknowledgement. The same stubbornness that had carried her through a frozen wilderness with a dying child on her back and no destination except away. The blood in her veins was not special because it was ancient or magical or blessed. It was special because the women who had carried it for 1,000 years had been the kind of women who simply refused to stop, who treated the boundary between possible and impossible as a suggestion rather than a wall, who held on when holding on was indistinguishable from dying, and did it anyway because letting go was not something Moonfang women knew how to do. Celine held. The energy poured through her body and into the lattice, and she held. Her vision was gone. Her hearing was gone. Her sense of her own body was reduced to a single point of white-hot awareness centered on her palms where they met the crystal. She could feel the lattice straining, the channels she had built filling to capacity and beyond, the 30% gap yawning like a mouth trying to swallow the excess. She took it. She absorbed it. She pulled it into herself and felt it burn through places that were not designed to carry this kind of load, and she held on anyway. The mountain shook. Crystal dust rained from the ceiling. Somewhere above, the ice wards detonated to life, a wall of frozen energy erupting from the mountain's surface with enough force to send shockwaves across the frozen reach. Thyra and her warriors braced against the blast and watched as the mountain lit up like a second moon, silver light pouring from every crack and seam in the rock. And on the far side of the Grey March, the approaching pale hand column stopped dead as the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. In the deep chamber, Celine screamed. Not a scream of fear, a scream of pure physical overload, the sound a body makes when it is carrying more than it was ever meant to carry, and the only alternative to screaming is breaking. She screamed and she held, and the crystals blazed and Lyra blazed, and the mountain sang with a voice it had not used in 15 years. Ravenna's hands moved across the secondary crystals, adjusting, modulating, redirecting flows with a precision that was almost surgical. She was sweating. Her jaw was clenched so tight the muscles stood out like ropes. But her hands were steady and her calculations were exact, and the compound in Lyra's blood was doing what she had designed it to do, channeling the activation energy into the lattice instead of letting it consume the girl who carried it. The surge peaked. For one eternal second, the entire mountain was a single unified system of blood and crystal and 1,000 years of accumulated determination, every Moonfang woman who had ever lived flowing through the lattice like a river of silver memory. And in that second, Celine felt them, her mother, her grandmother, the long unbroken chain of women who had built this place and held it and died for it and passed it on. Then the peak broke. The energy crested and began to recede. The light dimmed from blinding white to steady silver to a deep, calm glow that pulsed through the crystal veins like a heartbeat finding its resting rhythm. Celine's hands slid from the pillar. She collapsed to the stone floor. Her vision was a field of swimming lights. Her body felt like it had been dismantled and reassembled with pieces missing. She could not feel her legs. She could not feel her arms. She could feel her heart, though. It was beating. And somewhere in the ringing silence of the chamber, she could hear another heart beating too. Lyra. I am here, Mama. Lyra's voice, steady, strong, clear as a bell struck in cold air. I am here. I can feel the mountain. I can feel everything. Celine forced her eyes to focus. Lyra stood before the pillar with her hands still touching the surface, But she was not the same girl who had placed them there. The glow was gone from beneath her skin. It had moved into her eyes, which were no longer golden, but silver, pure liquid silver, the ancient moonfang eye color that had not appeared in the bloodline for 300 years. She stood taller. She stood differently. Not like a child. Like something that had been asleep for a very long time and had finally opened its eyes. "The lattice is stable," Ravenna said. She was kneeling beside a secondary crystal formation, her hand still pressed against it, reading the flows. "Full integration. Every channel is active. The ice wards are at 112% capacity. The mountain is—" She paused. Something moved across her face that was too complicated to name. "The mountain is awake." Above them, on the surface, Thyra watched the pale hand column break formation and scatter as the ice wards erupted along the entire northern frontier, a wall of crystalline force that had not existed 30 seconds ago, rising from the frozen ground like a mountain range born in a single breath. The warriors on the Moonfang walls let out a sound that was not quite a cheer and not quite a howl, but something in between, the sound of people who had been dying slowly for 15 years, suddenly realizing that they were not going to die today. The pale hand retreated. They had no choice. The defenses they had come to destroy had been rebuilt in the space of a single night, stronger than they had been in a century. Powered by a bloodline activation that their own intelligence had never predicted, because their models had been built on the assumption that Moonfang women would continue to operate alone, isolated, weakened by the divisions and betrayals that the Pale Hand had spent decades engineering. They had not accounted for the possibility that the 3 surviving carriers of the bloodline would stand in the same room and choose each other. The days after the activation passed in a rhythm that was new to Celine. She spent most of them in bed, recovering. Her body had paid the price for absorbing the excess surge. She could not walk for the first 4 days. Her hands shook for a week. The healers told her that the crystal burns on her palms would never fully heal, that the tissue had been restructured at a level too deep for conventional medicine to reach. She looked at the scars. Silver lines traced across both palms like a map drawn in light, the imprint of the lattice etched permanently into her skin. She closed her hands and opened them again and decided that she had been marked by worse things and survived. Lyra spent her days in the crystal chamber, learning. The activation had not just opened the lattice to her, it had opened her to the lattice. She could feel the mountain's entire defensive network the way Celine had once felt it, but deeper, wider, with a sensitivity that the elders said they had not witnessed in a living Moonfang for 3 centuries. The girl who had entered the mountain as a poisoned refugee was becoming something else entirely, something that the old stories had a name for, but that no one had expected to see again in their lifetime. Ravenna remained. She had not been welcomed, she had not been forgiven, but she had been recognized, grudgingly, as someone who possessed knowledge and skills that the clan needed, and in the Moonfang, usefulness had always been the first step toward belonging. She slept in the lower quarters, ate alone, spoke to no one except when the work demanded it. But Celine noticed that Thyra had assigned her the same room that Celine had occupied during her first weeks, the cell that was a cell in everything but name, and whether that was cruelty or acknowledgement or simply the Moonfang way of saying, you start where everyone starts, she could not be certain. On the 14th day after the activation, Celine walked to the main gate. Her legs were unsteady. The silver scars on her palms ached in the cold. But she walked under her own power and she stood at the gate and she looked south toward the wolf kingdom she had left behind. Thyra found her there. The scouts report that Dravenmore is falling, the old warrior said. The barrier collapsed completely 8 days ago. Beast hordes breached the southern districts. The noble houses have fractured. Kale is fighting a war on 4 fronts with an army that no longer trusts him. And Seraphine? Gone. Vanished the day the barrier fell, along with 3 members of the Privy Council and the entire contents of the Royal Treasury's secondary vault. Celine absorbed this without surprise. She had stopped being surprised by betrayal a long time ago. He will come here, she said. Eventually. When he has lost everything else and there is nowhere left to turn. He will come here and he will stand at this gate and he will ask me to save him. And will you? Celine watched the southern horizon. The sky was clear. The wind was cold. The ice wards hummed along the frontier, visible as a faint shimmer in the air, a wall of crystalline force that she had nearly died to rebuild, and her daughter was now sustaining with a power that grew stronger every day. I will save the people behind him, the soldiers who had no choice, the families who were never asked, the children who had nothing to do with any of it. I will open the gates for them, but I will not save him. He made his choices. He spoke his words. And some words once spoken cannot be unspoken, no matter how many frozen wastelands you cross to take them back. Thyra nodded. She did not argue. She had learned the same lesson in a different way a long time ago, and she recognized the finality in Celine's voice, the sound of a door closing that would never reopen. 3 weeks later, Kyle Draven arrived at the Moonfang Gate. He came alone. His armor was dented, blood-stained, missing pieces. His horse was half dead. He had lost weight, lost color, lost the predatory sheen that had once made him look like a weapon wearing a man's skin. He dismounted at the gate and stood in the snow and looked up at the walls, and Celine saw in his face something she had never seen before. Not fear. Kyle had never been afraid of anything external. What she saw was the internal version, the dawning comprehension of a man who had built his identity on strength and control and was discovering too late that identity built on dominance is the most fragile architecture in the world, because it requires everyone around you to remain smaller than you, and the moment they refuse, the entire structure collapses and there is nothing underneath. Celine stood on the wall above him. Lyra stood beside her with silver eyes and a stillness that had not existed in her before the activation. Ravenna stood on Celine's other side because the council had granted her provisional status 2 days ago, and she had chosen to spend her first act of limited freedom standing exactly where she was, flanking a mother she had not forgiven and might never forgive, but who was, at this moment, the closest thing to solid ground that Ravenna had ever known. Kyle looked up at them. 3 women. The wife he had discarded, the daughter he had dismissed, the daughter he had never known existed. 3 faces carrying the blood he had once called not worth mourning, looking down at him from walls he could not breach, standing on a foundation he could not shake, united by the one thing he had never understood and could never take from them. Selim, his voice was raw, stripped, the voice of a man who had swallowed every word he had ever spoken and found that they tasted exactly like what they were. I need your help. I know. The kingdom is falling. The hordes are inside the walls. My army is broken. I have lost everything. Not everything. You lost your kingdom, your power, your illusion. But you never had the things that actually mattered, KL. You just had the things that looked like they mattered. And now that they are gone, you are finding out what I found out the night you told me our daughter's blood was not worth mourning. That the only thing that holds when everything else falls apart is the thing you build with your own hands and feed with your own blood and protect with your own body. I built that. You watched me build it, and you thought it was nothing. Kyle stood in the snow and looked up at her and did not speak because there was nothing to say. Every argument, every justification, every cold pragmatic rationale that he had used to architect his reign was ash. The kingdom he had built on fear and dominance had dissolved the instant the force holding it together withdrew, because fear only works as a foundation when the thing people fear is present, and the thing people had actually feared in the Wolf Kingdom had never been Kyle. It had been the barrier, the protection, the safety, and that had been Celine. "Open the gates," Celine called to the garrison below. "Let the refugees through, families first, wounded second. Armed soldiers disarm at the threshold." She looked at Kyle one last time. He looked back. And in the silence between them, in the vast frozen space that separated the man on his knees in the snow from the woman standing on the wall above him, 15 years of marriage died. Its final death, and was buried without ceremony in the cold ground of a place that owed it nothing. "You can enter as a refugee," Celine said. "You will be fed. You will be sheltered. You will be treated like any other person who has lost their home and needs help. That is what the Moonfang do. We protect, even the things that hurt us, even the people who do not deserve it. But you will not enter as a king. You will not enter as my husband. And you will never, for as long as you live inside these walls, speak to my daughters as anything other than what you are. A man who has given everything and chose nothing." Kale closed his eyes. The snow fell around him. When he opened them again, the golden eyes that had once burned with the absolute certainty of a conqueror were dim, and in their dimness Celine saw something she had not expected and was not sure she wanted. Remorse. real remorse. Not performance, not strategy. The genuine article, arriving too late to change anything but early enough to hurt. She did not soften. Softening was what she had done for 15 years, and it had nearly killed her daughter and destroyed her clan and reduced her to a woman on her knees in an empty throne room begging a man who did not care to care. But she did not look away either. She held his gaze and let him see what she had become, and let that be the answer to every question he would never have the right to ask. Then she turned from the wall and walked into the mountain with her daughters beside her. The gate opened below. The refugees streamed in. And the Moonfang did what the Moonfang had always done. They held. Months passed. The mountain grew stronger. Lyra's connection to the lattice deepened daily, and the elders began speaking her name in the same breath as Elindra's, not as comparison, but as continuation, the next link in a chain that had been strained to its breaking point and had held anyway. Ravenna found her place slowly, painfully, the way a bone heals after a bad break, not smooth, not perfect, but functional and getting stronger. She and Celine did not have the conversation that needed to happen. Not yet. Some wounds need time to stop bleeding before you can examine them. But they worked together. They stood together. And sometimes, in the crystal chamber, when the lattice hummed and the light was silver and the mountain felt most alive, their hands would move in that same synchronized rhythm, and neither of them would mention it, and both of them would notice. Celine sat on the wall one evening in late winter and watched the sun set over the frozen reach. The sky was enormous, pink and gold and the deep bruised purple of approaching night. The ice ward shimmered along the frontier. Below in the courtyard, she could hear the sounds of a community rebuilding, hammer on stone, children running, the low murmur of people who had been through something terrible and were learning, day by day, to believe in something again. She looked down at her hands. The silver scars caught the fading light and threw it back in tiny fractured rainbows. She turned her palms up and studied them, the way you study a map of a place you have been, but do not fully recognize. She had lost a kingdom. She had lost a husband. She had lost 15 years and a version of herself that she could never get back. But she had gained something that none of those losses could touch. Something that Kael had never understood because he had spent his entire life acquiring things instead of building them. And there is a difference between the two that only becomes visible when everything acquired is stripped away. What remains when the taking stops is what was real all along. She closed her hands. She stood. She walked back into the mountain. The sun set. The stars appeared. And the mountain hummed beneath the frozen sky, alive, awake, held together by the blood of 3 women who had been broken and discarded and underestimated, and who had chosen, against every reasonable expectation, to hold anyway. Not because it was easy, not because they were special, because they were Moonfang. And Moonfang women do not let go.